Trump says U.S. hit Iranian military sites, warns it may finish the job. Egypt condemns Iranian attacks on Kuwait and Bahrain, urges return to diplomacy. And Trump backs Lebanon pledges support for Israel agreement implementation. Seven p.m. Cairo local time for the news, and here is the news in detail. U.S. President Donald Trump said American forces struck Iranian military sites after accusing Tehran of violating the ceasefire once again. Trump said U.S. aircraft carried out strikes on Iranian missile and drone storage sites, as well as coastal radar positions. In a post on Truth Social, Trump accused Iran of violating the ceasefire once again, saying the strikes were a direct response. He warned that Iran may never learn, adding that there could come a point when the United States would no longer be able to exercise restraint. Trump said that if such a scenario unfolds, the U.S. would be forced to finish the job it had begun, warning that Iran's future would then be at risk. Iranian state television said vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz must continue coordinating with the Revolutionary Guards. Iranian state television reported that ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz are still required to coordinate with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The broadcaster said the safest route for vessels entering the strait lies south of Hormuz Island, while ships leaving the waterway should use the passage south of Larak Island. U.S. Central Command said American forces carried out strikes on 10 Iranian military targets in and around the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. Central Command posted a video on X saying U.S. Navy and Air Force aircraft struck 10 Iranian military targets at multiple locations in and around the Strait of Hormuz. CENTCOM said the operation was carried out in response to a drone attack targeting the oil tanker MT Kiko in the strait. The foreign ministers of Egypt and Qatar have discussed regional developments, including the U.S.-Iran negotiations and the situation in Lebanon. Egyptian Foreign Minister Badr Abdulati and Qatari Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani held a phone call to review bilateral ties and regional developments. According to Egypt's Foreign Ministry, the two ministers stressed the importance of building on the ongoing U.S.-Iran negotiating track following the Memorandum of Understanding, saying its implementation should help reduce tensions, strengthen regional security, and ensure freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz in line with international law. They also welcomed the U.S. brokered framework agreement on Lebanon, calling for its full implementation to reinforce Lebanon's security, stability, and sovereignty, while stressing the need for a full Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon and an end to Israeli attacks. Kuwait said its armed forces intercepted two hostile ballistic missiles that entered the country's airspace early on Sunday. Kuwait's defense ministry said the armed forces detected two hostile ballistic missiles in Kuwaiti airspace before dawn on Sunday. Official spokesperson Colonel Saud Abdelaziz Al-Qutaibi added both missiles were intercepted and dealt with in accordance with approved operational procedures. He added that the incident caused no casualties or material damage. Bahrain said its defense systems intercepted and destroyed multiple Iranian aerial attacks targeting the kingdom early on Sunday. Bahrain's defense force said its defense systems intercepted and destroyed what it described as several Iranian missiles and drone attacks. In a statement, the military accused Iran of deliberately targeting civilians and civilian properties, calling the attacks a violation of international humanitarian law. The defense force added all military units remain on the highest level of readiness to protect the kingdom. Authorities urged the public to avoid approaching any suspicious objects or debris believed to be linked to the attacks and to report them immediately, adding that military engineering teams are prepared to safely dispose of any unexploded remnants. Egypt has strongly condemned what it described as Iranian missile and drone attacks targeting Kuwait and Bahrain. In a statement, Egypt's foreign ministry condemned the reported Iranian missile and drone attacks on Kuwait and Bahrain, calling them a flagrant violation of the two countries' sovereignty and a direct threat to their security and stability. Cairo said the attacks represent an unacceptable escalation that could undermine regional and international efforts to preserve calm and reduce tensions. Egypt reaffirmed its full solidarity with Kuwait and Bahrain, expressing support for all measures taken by the two countries to safeguard their security and stability. The Foreign Ministry also called for continued commitment to the ongoing negotiating track, stressing that dialogue and peaceful means remain the best path to resolving disputes and strengthening regional security. Saudi Arabia has strongly condemned what it described as an Iranian drone attack targeting Bahrain early on Sunday. In a statement, the Saudi Foreign Ministry denounced the reported Iranian drone attack on Bahraini territory, calling it a violation of international law and the United Nations Charter. The ministry said such actions undermine international efforts aimed at restoring security and stability across the region. Saudi Arabia reaffirmed its full solidarity with Bahrain and expressed support for all measures taken by Manama to protect its sovereignty, security, and stability. The United Arab Emirates has strongly condemned what it described as Iranian missile and drone attacks targeting Bahrain and Kuwait. In a statement, the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs condemned what it called renewed Iranian attacks on Bahrain and Kuwait involving missiles and drones. The ministry said these strikes constitute a flagrant violation of the sovereignty of both Gulf states and pose a threat to their security and stability. The United Arab Emirates reaffirmed its full solidarity with Bahrain and Kuwait, pledging support for all measures aimed at safeguarding their security and stability. Well, for more insight into these developments, let's now join my colleague Riham Morsi. Riham.
Thank you so much, Mona. Ladies and gentlemen, for more on the latest developments, we're joined from Egypt by the international relations expert and specialist Mohammed Osman. Thank you for joining us this evening here on Qnews.
Thank you for having me, Riham. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely is. Let's start off by asking you, how do you assess the most recent U.S. strikes on Iran and Iran strikes as well?
It seems that the United States and Iran have entered into an endless loop, Riham, unfortunately. It seems that they have went into these negotiations, signed a memorandum of understanding that are supposed to push them or pull them from the area of uncertainty and conflict and mutual distrust to an area where they can conduct an orderly negotiations in the right spirit or in the appropriate spirit. What's happening is that both of them are retaining the same mentality they have retained during the conflict and during the ceasefire. which means that the United States insists on adopting its same stance on establishing an equation of absolute military deterrence, of enforcing its perception or how it reads the interpretation of the agreement by force, if need be, when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz. And on the other hand, Iran still retains the mentality of violent resilience, meaning that they will always be able to establish asymmetrical deterrence against the United States by answering strikes and also by enforcing their interpretation of the agreement by force, like what they are doing in the Strait of Hormuz with the incessant targeting of civilian vessels as attempting to traverse the international waterway without having to coordinate with the Iranians through the Omani passageway. So this seems to be the problem. And if both sides, Reham, retain this mentality, this memorandum of understanding and these negotiations are destined to fail.
So you mentioned the idea of a never-ending loop there, and that it is destined to fail. But is there a possibility here, or do you believe that this agreement or the peace agreement between the United States and Iran right now could possibly somehow also survive if both sides decide to sort of, bring down the tensions and stop attacks in the Strait of Hormuz? Is this even a possibility?
Absolutely, of course it is. And when I said that it's destined to fail, I meant in the situation or in the scenario where both of them retain this current mentality, which they are not supposed to retain under any circumstances. I do believe that at least the most senior element in the U.S. leadership, being President Trump and Vice President Vance at this point, are committed to an agreement. Maybe the U.S. deep state and the military-industrial complex had other ideas, as well as Israel, of course. However, the supreme political authority in the United States and most of the American public opinion support going for a political settlement at this point. And on the other hand, at least the most visible senior elements from the regime, which is the Speaker of Parliament, Ali Bakr Qalibaf, and President Pezeshkian, in the political establishment, both of them are very supportive of reaching an agreement and are committed to not letting these negotiations fail. However, inside Iran itself, there are other forces that are opposed to this agreement. Imagine, Reham, even though this memorandum of understanding is not balanced at all, it's actually excessively in favor of Iran, in my view. The United States presented very, very unexpected concessions because they are so eager, or at least President Trump is so eager to end this war and end the global economic bleed that he caused by this war of aggression, unprovoked war of aggression he waged against Iran along with the Israelis. The Iranians, unfortunately, now are smelling weakness and blood. So they are doubling down on their negotiating position, which is complicating the situation. And I think this pushed the Americans to basically signal to the Iranians through what happened yesterday and the day before that they are willing to go back to striking Iran if need be. However, both of them, at least at this point, are committed to an agreement. But the problem is, back to the Iranian issue, because this is very important, there are divisions within Iran, not only differences of opinion. It seems there are divisions within the regime over the idea of a settlement with the United States. For example, the Guardian Council, which appoints the supreme leader of Iran, issued a very, very rare and rather amusing statement yesterday, signed by over 60 members of the 86 members of the Guardian Council. And they warned against the current trajectory of the negotiations, and they insisted that the politicians or that the political class should still be committed to the instructions of the hidden supreme leader at this point, Mujtaba Khamenei, and that they should not yield any concessions in the nuclear field. Actually, they are demanding that the nuclear issue be taken entirely off the table. And this actually caused President Pezeshkian today actually flew to Qom, the religious capital of Iran, basically, where the Guardian Council is, in order to negotiate with those clerics and tell them that they have to tone it down a bit. But this is an indicator that the most radical factions of the regime, including, of course, most probably the leadership of the IRGC, which is basically has become a state within a state, are not really for an agreement under the current conditions. So unfortunately, there are structural flaws in the agreement that may cause its failure. However, if both leaderships possess the necessary will and the readiness to present mutual logical concessions,
but
maybe
do you think that
it will succeed.
Do you think that the current flare-up between the United States and Iran is related to Lebanon? Because we saw earlier, before the strikes took place, that reporters were asking Marco Rubio when he was in the Gulf at the time that maybe that the Israelis, there are reports that Israelis are attempting to blow up the negotiating process by attacking Lebanon. Is this the reason behind the flare-up, not necessarily the negotiations or the points, as you said? The points within the framework itself are to the benefit of Iran rather than to their detriment.
Of course, I don't think Israel is directly involved in what's going on in the Gulf at the moment. However, in the bigger scheme of things and in the bigger picture, of course, Israel is involved by complicating the situation in Lebanon. However, now with the new agreement that has been reached between Israel and Lebanon on the U.S. auspices, it seems that some of the provisions of this framework agreement actually come in violation, at least in part, arguably, of the Iranian U.S. Memorandum of Understanding when it comes to Lebanon. Because basically, even though it says that there has to be a ceasefire and that Israel will have to eventually, someday, somehow withdraw from Lebanon after of course, conditionally, which means after Hezbollah disarms, that practically means on the ground that Israel is not obligated to withdraw from the security zone in Lebanon, the occupied area, which is about 600 square kilometers, in the near future, which the Iranians read as a violation. And this is not only an Israeli attempt, this is the doing of the United States. This agreement was imposed by the United States in order to separate Lebanon from Iran, arguably. However, if anything, it only leads to complicating the situation in Lebanon even further. And Lebanon will remain a major sticking point. However, I do not believe, Reham, that Lebanon is sufficient to torpedo the U.S.-Iran agreement. However, the Strait of Hormuz is sufficient to torpedo that agreement. The nuclear program is way more than sufficient because it is the raison d'etre of this entire crisis, is sufficient to torpedo and utterly dismantle this agreement and throw us back to square one. And with all of this in hindsight, I do not believe that escalation is imminent. I believe that at least these negotiations will be conducted and the Memorandum of Understanding will survive throughout the 60 days. However, after the 60 days, they might be extended by another 60 days or by another 30 days, as President Trump likes to do. And maybe there will be a few flare-ups here and there and Trump issuing crazy ultimatums. However, after all of this is exhausted to the bone, and if nothing is reached, hear my words, Reham, we will have a third round of fighting if this happens.
Let's hope that it doesn't reach that point there. But thank you so much for your insights, international relations expert, joining us this evening here on Qnews. And now we head back to Mona in the studio. Back to you, Mona.
Right, thank you so much, Reham, for the analysis. And we'll get back to you to tell us more about the World Cup 2026 latest. Back to our bulletin, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said an Israeli delegation will travel to Washington for talks on Iran's nuclear program. Netanyahu said an Israeli delegation will soon head to Washington for discussions on Iran's nuclear program. The visit comes as high-level negotiations continue between the United States and Iran over a potential long-term nuclear agreement. Netanyahu added Israeli officials would present what he described as Israel's interests during the discussions on Iran's nuclear program.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين. وضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
U.S. President Donald Trump has reaffirmed Washington's support for Lebanon during a phone call with Lebanese President Joseph Aoun following the signing of the U.S. brokered framework agreement with Israel. According to the Lebanese presidency, President Donald Trump congratulated Lebanese President Joseph Aoun on the signing of the U.S.-brokered framework agreement between Lebanon and Israel. Trump reaffirmed Washington's commitment to supporting Lebanon and assisting with the implementation of the agreement to restore security and stability. Aoun thanked Trump for backing Lebanon's legitimate institutions, saying the Lebanese state would fulfill its responsibilities under the agreement. He also called on the United States to help prevent violations and press Israel to withdraw from occupied areas in southern Lebanon. The Lebanese presidency said Trump also pledged continued U.S. support for Lebanon's sovereignty, armed forces, and economy, and expressed hope for a future meeting with Aoun in Washington. The Lebanese army has urged the public to act responsibly, warning it will not tolerate any actions that threaten security or public order during planned protests. The Lebanese armed forces called on citizens to exercise responsibility amid calls for demonstrations in Beirut and other areas following protests against the framework agreement involving Lebanon, Israel and the United States. In a statement, the army said it would not allow any breach of security, threats to civil peace, or the blocking of roads. The military added that Lebanon is facing exceptional challenges and stressed that national unity and solidarity are essential to overcome what it described as the dangers confronting the country. And now to the World Cup for all the latest sports updates. And to you, Riham, again.
Yes, things are getting exciting here in the World Cup. Thank you, Mona. And Egypt's captain Mohamed Salah has been diagnosed with a hamstring strain ahead of the Pharaohs' round of 32 clash against Australia at the FIFA World Cup. Egypt team doctor Mohamed Abu Laila said scans confirmed that the captain, Mohamed Salah, sustained a hamstring strain after experiencing discomfort during Egypt's match against Iran, forcing him to leave the field. The medical staff said Salah has already begun his rehabilitation program. Meanwhile, Egypt's team director Ibrahim Hassan confirmed the squad will travel on Wednesday to Dallas, Texas, aboard a charter flight provided by FIFA. Egypt will face Australia on Friday in the round of 32 as they look to continue their FIFA World Cup campaign. Algeria and Austria have both reached the FIFA World Cup round of 32 after playing out a dramatic 3-3 draw in their final Group J match. Algeria and Austria booked their place in the FIFA World Cup after entertaining a 3-3 draw in the final fixture. The result was enough for both teams to progress to the knockout stages, securing qualification from the group. Algeria fought back to earn a share of the points in the match that produced 6 goals, while Austria also did enough to steal the place for the next round. Both sides now turn their attention to the round of 32, where they will look to continue the World Cup campaigns. And now we go back to Mona Musalhi for today's main headlines, making headlines for this evening.
Well, thank you so much, Riham, and here is a quick recap. Top stories making headlines this hour. Trump says U.S. hit Iranian military sites, warns it may finish the job. Egypt condemns Iranian attacks on Kuwait and Bahrain, urges return to diplomacy. And Trump backs Lebanon pledged support for Israel agreement implementation. That's all for this hour. Q News Bulletin. As the day's development continue to unfold, our coverages will continue as well. Stay with us on Q News.